Imagine a world lit by torchlight and the low golden glow of oil lamps, a city of marble and dust, shadows and song, a city that pulses at the center of everything. Rome, ancient even before Julius Caesar was born, a city whose very stones remember the footsteps of kings, soldiers, thieves, and dreamers. Every wall carries a secret. Every narrow alley whispers with the laughter and the tears of generations. Listen closely, and you can almost hear it, the distant clang of blacksmiths at work, the cries of vendors in the crowded marketplace, the steady, determined rhythm of sandaled feet on cobblestones, all weaving together the restless heartbeat of an empire. Rome is a living paradox, both eternal and ever-changing, a city that basks in the sunlight of its triumphs while trembling under the weight of its anxieties and fears. For centuries, Rome has grown, swallowing new lands, stretching its influence across seas and mountains, drawing people from distant horizons with the promise of fortune or the threat of war. In the beginning, its strength lay in Unitia, small, disciplined city-state, where the Senate debated and soldiers farmed the land when they were not marching out to defend it. Victories against Carthage, the rise of proud generals, the conquest of Greece and Spain, all these triumphs fed a swelling sense of destiny. Yet with every victory, Rome gathered not only gold and glory, but trouble as well. The spoils of war flooded into the hands of a few, while old customs that once bound rich and poor began to unravel. In the cool, shaded atriums of their grand villas, the patrician elite hosted banquets where wine flowed and exotic dancers performed, far removed from the realities faced by the farmers and craftsmen whose labor sustained the city. Beneath the laughter and the music, resentment simmered. Small farms, once the pride of Roman citizenship, vanished, swallowed up by enormous estates worked by slaves, leaving the freeborn poor to crowd the city in search of work and bread. Veterans, whose courage had bought Rome its victories, returned home to find their land taken, their sacrifices forgotten, their futures uncertain. The gap between rich and poor widened into a chasm, and ancient streets became battlegrounds for new ambitions. In the twisting lanes of the Subura, where life was always uncertain, young men learned that survival meant cunning, alliances, and sometimes the willingness to betray. While the marble columns of the Forum still gleamed in the sun, the spirit of the Republic was changing in ways both subtle and profound. Inside the Senate, old men debated tradition, determined to keep power tightly gripped in their wrinkled hands. They argued, they postured, they invoked the names of ancestors whose virtues now seemed like distant myths. The Senate was designed to prevent any single man from becoming king again, but as the Republic grew larger and more complicated, its laws and customs began to show their age. Ambitious generals and charismatic leaders discovered how to bend the rules, how to make the machinery of state serve not the many, but the few. Corruption became as common as the midday sun. Votes were bought and sold openly, while governors sent to faraway provinces used their posts not to serve Rome, but to line their own pockets, returning to the city as newly minted millionaires. Yet for all its flaws, Rome remained a city of astonishing possibility. It was a place where a boy from a family fallen on hard times could, with the right mixture of luck, charm, and ruthless ambition, hope to carve his name into history. It was a city where you could vanish in the crowd or rise above it, where every day brought new opportunities and new dangers. There were feasts and festivals, religious rituals and political riots, poets reciting in candlelit courtyards, and thieves lurking in the shadows of the Circus Maximus after dark. There was fear, but also hope, woven into the fabric of every sunrise. All the while, distant thunder rolled across the Republic, warning of the storms to come. Ambitious men like Marius and Sulla had already shown how quickly Rome could turn on itself, how easily the Republic's delicate balance could be shattered by violence and vengeance. Civil wars left scars that no speech or monument could heal. Blood was spilled not by foreign enemies, but by Roman hands on Roman soil. Laws were rewritten, then broken, Friends became rivals. Rivals became enemies. Rome, the city of dreams, teetered on a knife edge, uncertain whether it would stand forever or fall like all those who had come before. In this city of contradictions, crowded with hope and haunted by fear, Julius Caesar would rise. But before his story could begin, Rome itself had to set the stage. A city, glittering with promise and trembling with anxiety, holding its breath as it waited for the dawn of a new and uncertain age. Julius Caesar entered the world not as a legend, but as a child of uncertainty born into the Julian clan, a family whose name was ancient, even if their fortunes had quietly faded. On a sweltering July day, as Rome baked beneath the summer sun and the city's sounds drifted through open windows, he drew his first breath. His parents would name him Gaius Julius Caesar, a name carried by ancestors and destined to outshine them all, though no one could have known it yet. The Julian family traced their bloodline to the goddess Venus herself, or so the stories claimed, but the grandeur of old tales did little to ease daily worries. Their home, tucked not in the wealthy Palatine but in the bustling, crowded district of the Subura, was comfortable but hardly grand. The streets outside were noisy with merchants calling out their wares and children darting between the feet of hurried adults. Life in this corner of Rome was vibrant and unpredictable, filled with the mingled scents of baking bread, sweat, and the ever-present dust of a restless city. From the beginning, Caesar lived in the world of women as much as men. His mother, Aurelia, would leave a lasting impression. Her intelligence, dignity, and quiet strength guiding him long after his father was gone. She managed the household with a careful balance of grace and discipline, insisting on the importance of education and self-control. The young Caesar listened to her stories and advice, learning to read people as easily as he read the works of poets and philosophers. His father, also named Gaius Julius Caesar, served Rome with distinction, but he was not a man of lasting power. His death came suddenly, leaving Caesar, still only a teenager, as the new head of his household. It was a heavy mantle to bear, responsibility settling onto his shoulders before the lines of boyhood had vanished from his face. The Rome of Caesar's youth was uneasy, its politics as changeable as the Tiber's current. The air crackled with rumor and fear as Sulla, a ruthless warlord, swept into the city, hunting down his enemies and rewriting the rules of power. Caesar was just a boy, but even he could not escape the chaos. Through blood and law, he was tied to Marius, Sulla's rival, his uncle by marriage, a hero to some, an outlaw to others. Family alliances, once a source of security, now became a source of danger. Sulla demanded that Caesar divorce his young wife, Cornelia, daughter of Cinna, who had been an ally to Marius. To refuse was to risk everything, his wealth, his title, his very life. Yet the teenager stood firm, choosing loyalty over safety, love over fear. This decision marked him as both stubborn and brave, and it would nearly cost him his life. Stripped of his inheritance, his priesthood, and the comfort of certainty, Caesar was forced into hiding. He lived for weeks among the marshes and back alleys of Rome's outskirts, moving from place to place, sleeping beneath unfamiliar roofs, always watching for the soldiers who would drag him to a violent end. The feverish nights were filled with the hum of insects and the quiet prayers of a boy not yet a man, but already shaped by adversity. The power struggles of great men had trickled down into the narrow lanes and shabby doorways, threatening even those who only wished to be left alone. In this crucible, Caesar learned to be cautious, to read the shifting moods of those around him, to expect little and plan for anything. Eventually, his mother's family interceded, pleading for mercy. Sulla, who could be both brutal and strangely perceptive, relented but not without warning. In this boy, he is said to have remarked, there are many Mariuses. The shadow of this prophecy would linger long after Sulla's own power faded. Caesar's early years were marked by a strange blend of fear and resilience. While his peers jostled for positions at banquets and courted favor among the powerful, he walked a different pathone, lined with uncertainty and sharpened by necessity. These were the years that hardened him, that taught him patience and daring, and filled him with the resolve never again to be powerless. Returning to Rome after Sulla's death, Caesar found a city that was outwardly familiar, but inwardly changed. The rituals of the Senate continued, the markets bustled as they always had, but beneath the surface, nothing was the same. Old laws seemed hollow, and old alliances brittle. Corruption was no longer whispered about in secret, but discussed openly, a simple fact of life. Elections could be bought with silver, and justice was often a matter of who could pay the highest price. For the young Caesar, these years were an education sharper than any scroll or tutor could provide. He learned to navigate the treacherous currents of Roman society, forging friendships and making enemies, keeping secrets and observing the ambitions of those who fancied themselves above the rules. Yet even as he learned the games of power, Caesar never forgot the lessons of hardship. The memory of hiding, of hunger and danger remained with him, a quiet drumbeat beneath every bold decision. It shaped his sympathy for the ordinary Roman and taught him that survival was only the beginning. True greatness lay in mastering fortune, not fleeing from it. In the evenings, when the city quieted and the Tiber glimmered beneath the stars, young Caesar would look out from his window and wonder what future awaited him. He was restless, aware that he stood at the edge of something vast and mysterious, a city teetering between ruin and greatness, waiting for someone bold enough to seize its tangled destiny. For now, he remained a young man with much to prove, but already, in the silent corners of his heart, the old fears had begun to give way to a new and unshakable ambition. Caesar's path forward was anything but certain, shaped not just by the comfort of his family's home, but by the harsh lessons that came from loss and exile. His father's death had forced him into adulthood, but it was the years that followed when he lived on the edge of power, sometimes just out of reach of those who meant him harm, that truly forged the steel of his character. Even as a youth, he showed glimpses of what would one day set him apart. His education was rigorous and broad, a privilege of patrician birth, but he approached his studies with a seriousness that made him stand out. He mastered the languages of poets and philosophers, Greek and Latin, reading the classics and learning from the histories and tragedies that had shaped not only Rome, but the world beyond. His tutors remarked on his piercing gaze and the way he listened quietly, intently absorbing information and storing it away for later use. His mother Aurelia's influence was everywhere, in the discipline with which he approached each day, in the calm way he handled setbacks, and in the subtle grace that helped him move easily among people of higher and lower rank. He was quick to smile, quicker to remember a name or a promise, and even as a teenager, he displayed a talent for persuading others to see things his way. Yet for all the polish and learning, his adolescence was far from sheltered. As Rome buckled under the turbulence of Sulla's prescriptions, young Caesar walked a razor's edge, his family's ties to Marius making him a target. When Sulla demanded he put aside his new wife Cornelia, Caesar refused, choosing personal honor and loyalty over safety or advantage. This defiance forced him into hiding, but also earned him a reputation for courage and resolve. On the run, Caesar found unlikely allies among ordinary Romans: fishermen, shepherds, even former soldiers learning to blend in and survive by wit and adaptability rather than privilege. Illness struck him as he hid in marshlands and country huts, and for weeks he suffered from fever, shivering under rough blankets and staring up at unfamiliar ceilings. Yet even in hardship, he did not despair. He watched and listened, learning about the lives and grievances of those whom Roman politicians too often ignored. These early trials became a quiet strength, a memory he would draw upon years later when he needed the trust of men who had little reason to trust any aristocrat. When Sulla finally relented and Caesar was able to return, he was changed. The city he re-entered was not the Rome of his childhood, but a place where power was always in motion, shifting like light on the Tiber's surface. Old enemies had fallen, new men had risen. Caesar began his climb, not with bold declarations, but with careful steps, finding mentors among Rome's orators and philosophers, seeking out the company of those who could teach him the skills of rhetoric, debate, and diplomacy. He attended trials, watched the performances of advocates, and even wrote poetry, though he was quick to abandon any verses that failed to please the critics. Soon, opportunity called him away from Rome and toward adventure. He served as a young officer in Asia Minor, on the staff of a provincial governor, where he saw his first real combat and discovered the chaos of war was not so different from the chaos of Roman politics. During the siege of a rebellious city, Caesar showed unusual bravery, earning a civic crown for saving a fellow soldier's life. The taste of danger thrilled him, and the experience of commanding men, even briefly, lit a spark of ambition that would never leave him. But his travels brought more than glory. On the journey home, pirates seized his ship, capturing him and demanding ransom. Instead of shrinking before them, Caesar reportedly laughed at the sum they asked for his life, insisting he was worth far more. For weeks he lived among his captors, charming them with stories and threats delivered in the same breath, promising that once free, he would return and have them crucified. True to his word, after his release, he hunted them down and carried out his threat, showing that beneath the cultured charm lay a will of iron and a readiness for ruthlessness that Rome would soon come to fear and admire. These years of wandering and trial were a second education, as important as anything he learned in books. Caesar encountered new customs and ideas, witnessed firsthand the divisions between Rome and the provinces, and developed an instinct for understanding what moved people, fear, hope, pride, and ambition. He built friendships that would last a lifetime and crossed paths with men whose names would one day fill history's pages. Even in these early years, he became known for generosity to friends and sharp retaliation against those who crossed him. With his return to Rome, Caesar's reputation as a survivor and a man of promise began to grow. He was still young, but already marked by the quiet confidence of someone who had faced death and prevailed. He understood, in a way that few of his peers could, that fortune was fickle and that the line between power and peril was thin. This understanding bred not caution, but an eagerness to seize every opportunity, to win every friend, and to turn every setback into a stepping stone. His ambition was no longer merely to survive, but to excel, to be remembered, to make his name echo down the centuries. As the city bustled around him, markets opening at dawn, senators debating by midday, and the crowds surging through narrow streets in the evening, Caesar sharpened his skills and waited for the moment when Rome, ever restless and unpredictable, would give him his chance. Every lesson from his difficult youth became a tool, every hardship, a memory that pushed him onward. The world was opening before him, vast and uncertain, and Caesar was ready to step into its light, knowing already that his journey would shape not only his own destiny, but the fate of Rome itself. Returning to Rome after his wanderings, Caesar found a city both familiar and utterly transformed. The rituals of politics and the rhythms of daily life continued, but beneath the surface, everything felt brittle and uncertain. The old values, honor, discipline, service to the Republic, were still spoken of in the Senate and taught to the children of noble families, yet their substance had thinned, eroded by years of corruption, violence, and the slow poisoning of ambition unchecked by law. Caesar, keenly aware of how quickly fortunes could change, understood that success in this new Rome depended not just on ancestry or wealth, but on the ability to read people, to sense opportunity, and to seize it before others even realized it was there. He began the next phase of his life with cautious steps, choosing not to flaunt his noble birth, but instead to blend in among Rome's bustling masses. He moved his household to the Subura, that vibrant, crowded district alive with the shouts of vendors and the smoke of street kitchens, where men and women from every walk of life brushed shoulders and shared rumors. There, Caesar built alliances, not with the city's grandest families, but with its working-class artisans, shopkeepers, soldiers, freedmen, those who could be counted on in the turbulent, uncertain world of Roman politics. Through generous feasts, thoughtful gestures, and the well-timed forgiveness of debts, he crafted a network of supporters who would cheer his victories and shield him from enemies. It was a slow, deliberate process, built on hundreds of small acts of kindness and cunning, but it was a foundation stronger than marble. With each passing year, Caesar climbed the political ladder, progressing through the cursus honorum, the formal sequence of public offices expected of any ambitious Roman. He began as a quaestor, managing finances in a distant province, where he gained a reputation for fairness, and where he saw again how the promise of Rome could curdle into oppression at the hands of corrupt officials. Next, as aedile, he was responsible for public games and the maintenance of temples, and here his flair for spectacle blossomed. He staged games more lavish than any in living memory, filling the streets with parades, contests, and feasts, all funded by enormous loans that left him deeply in debt, but bought him the affection of the people and the wary admiration of his rivals. Critics whispered that he was reckless, gambling his future on the fleeting cheers of the crowd, but Caesar saw further. Each denarius spent was an investment in loyalty, each act of generosity a seed planted for harvest in years yet to come. As his fame grew, so did his enemies. The Senate was wary of this young patrician, who seemed so at ease among the poor, and so indifferent to the customs that kept the classes apart. Yet Caesar was always one step ahead, weaving alliances even among those who distrusted him. He knew the value of patience, of allowing opponents to underestimate him, of letting rivals exhaust themselves in petty squabbles while he waited for the right moment to act. His oratory, honed by years of study, could sway a crowd or a jury. His wit disarmed critics and deflected dangerous accusations. When he lost gracefully, always ready to try again, undaunted by temporary setbacks. Behind his charm and confidence, Caesar was calculating. He borrowed immense sums from Rome's wealthiest men, especially Marcus Crassus, the richest citizen of his age. These debts, terrifying to any cautious soul, became a weapon because so long as he owed fortunes, his creditors were invested in his survival, bound to him by the promise of future repayment through lucrative political appointments and contracts. To the people, Caesar was a champion. To the elite, he was a necessary, if dangerous, ally. This delicate balancing act demanded constant attention. Each favor was tracked, each insult remembered. He learned when to forgive, when to punish, and when to let his enemies destroy themselves. The political world was more volatile than ever. Rome's elections were increasingly violent, with street gangs supporting rival candidates, and bribery was so common that few even pretended it was not the norm. Caesar did not shrink from these realities. Instead, he navigated them with the same agility he had learned as a youth, hiding from Sulla's soldiers. He gave dazzling funeral orations that moved crowds to tears and laughter. At the funeral of his aunt Julia, the widow of Marius, he broke with tradition. Displaying the ancestral masks of the once exiled generala pointed challenge to the old guard and a powerful reminder of his family's claim to Rome's highest honors. When his wife Cornelia died young, Caesar's public grief was genuine and moving, but he also understood how to use such moments to deepen the public's attachment to his story. He was relentless in his ambitions, but he hid that steel beneath a cloak of civility and good humor. When accused of inappropriate relations with King Nicomedes of Bithynia, rumor meant to ruin him, he laughed it off, turning scandal into a joke and neutralizing the attack. He made sure never to be isolated, always building bridges to rivals, making allies of former enemies, and keeping his options open. For every senator who grumbled about his methods, there were two who owed him favors or who hoped to benefit from his rise. Caesar's quest for higher office was relentless but shrewd. He secured the position of Pontifex Maximus, Rome's chief priest, not because of his piety, but through carefully orchestrated bribes and promises, outmaneuvering older and more experienced candidates. This title gave him not only immense prestige, but a grand house in the very center of the city, close to the political heart of Rome, and a new aura of sacred authority to cloak his ambitions. Each step forward was risky, yet each success made him stronger, his debts more manageable, his base of support more secure. Even when posted to distant Spain as governor, Caesar turned hardship into opportunity. There, surrounded by rugged mountains and fierce local tribes, he led campaigns that brought both victory and plunder, allowing him to pay down his debts and return to Rome as a hero. He wept at the sight of a statue of Alexander the Great, lamenting that, at the same age, Alexander had conquered the world, while he, Caesar, had yet to achieve greatness. But such moments of doubt only fueled his determination. With every challenge, he grew more ambitious, more daring, more certain that Rome's future belonged to those bold enough to claim it. He did not wait for opportunity, he created it, forging new alliances with men like Pompey the Great, Rome's most celebrated general, and Marcus Crassus, the city's wealthiest man. This would become the first triumvirate, a secret partnership that would shift the balance of power in Rome. But before this alliance was sealed, Caesar's reputation as a leader, a charmer, and a visionary had already set him apart in a city where fortunes were made and lost in the blink of an eye. Every day, he woke to a city roaring with the sound of ambition and anxiety, a city where yesterday's friends could be today's rivals, where every public act was watched, judged, remembered. Caesar's climb was dangerous, demanding endless energy and careful calculation, but as he moved steadily upward, he never forgot the lessons of his youth. Survival was no longer enough. He was determined to leave his mark, not just as a survivor, but as a shaper of history, someone whose very name would become a legend, whispered by torchlight long after the marble of Rome had crumbled to dust. The path to power in Rome had always been treacherous, but by the time Caesar returned from Spain with military laurels and pockets filled from spoils, the city was a maze of shifting loyalties and dangerous ambitions. The old system, built to check the rise of kings, was crumbling. In its place, a handful of men jostled for dominance, each with enough followers, wealth, and reputation to sway the masses, but none strong enough to stand alone. It was in this atmosphere of rivalry and intrigue that Caesar saw an opportunity no one else dared to grasp, the chance to forge an alliance that would allow him to leap beyond the slow-moving politics of tradition and seize the heights he had always coveted. Two figures already loomed large over Roman life. Gnaeus Pompeius, Magnus Pompey, the Great, stood as the Republic's preeminent general, his very name inspiring awe. He had vanquished pirates, who once terrorized the Mediterranean, subdued rebellious provinces, and doubled the boundaries of Roman rule. Yet, for all his victories, Pompey found himself hemmed in by the Senate's jealousy. His requests for land grants, for his veterans, and for the ratification of his eastern settlements were met not with gratitude, but with suspicion and delay. To the conservative elite, Pompey was too powerful, a threat to the fragile balance they had always tried to maintain. The second man was Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest citizen in Rome and a master of manipulation. Crassus had made his fortune through property speculation, clever investments, and a ruthless exploitation of every crisis that struck the city. He had put down the great slave revolt led by Spartacus, and his vast wealth allowed him to buy influence in every corner of Roman society. But for all his gold, Crassus lacked the unshakable popularity and military prestige that Pompey enjoyed. Both men, at heart, were rivals, their ambitions circling each other like wary wolves, each unwilling to yield, yet both frustrated by the Senate's intransigence. Into this tense landscape stepped Caesar, freshly returned from conquest and burning with the knowledge that time was running out. His debts, though greatly diminished by his Spanish campaigns, still pressed upon him like a weight. His enemies in the Senate, fearful of his rising star, maneuvered to sideline him by assigning him insignificant provincial commands, hoping to keep him far from the levers of real power. But Caesar, ever alert, saw what neither Pompey nor Crassus had fully grasped, that their mutual frustration could be transformed into collective strength. It took skillful negotiation and subtle flattery, but Caesar was uniquely positioned. He was close to both men. Pompey had married his beloved daughter Julia, forging a genuine family bond, while Crassus had long been his chief creditor and occasional ally. Caesar proposed a secret pact, a private arrangement to pool their resources and overcome the Senate's obstruction. The result was the first triumviratian alliance that would not be enshrined in law, nor even acknowledged in public, but that would, for a time, dominate Rome's future. The agreement was simple in its aims, but revolutionary in its effect. Pompey would get his land grants and the confirmation of his eastern settlements. Crassus would secure lucrative tax contracts for his business allies, especially in the wealthy eastern provinces. Caesar himself would be guaranteed election as consultor, highest magistracy in Rome, followed by a command in Gaul, where new military glory and fortunes could be won. The three men, each needing what the others could provide, would act in concert, presenting a united front against the Senate's resistance. The repercussions were immediate. In the elections for consul, Caesar's supporters swarmed the forum, backed by Pompey's veteran-silent reminders of the general's power, and Crassus's agents distributed bribes with practiced efficiency. The opposition, led by Marcus Bibulus, attempted to block Caesar at every turn, even resorting to declaring bad omens in a desperate bid to stall legislation. When Bibulus was attacked by a mob and driven from the forum, Caesar pressed ahead, passing laws that pleased both his partners and the common people. Land was distributed to Pompey's veterans and the urban poor. Pompey's eastern settlements were ratified, and Crassus's allies received favorable treatment in tax contracts. Rome had not seen such swift and audacious rule in living memory. The alliance was cemented by more than political convenience. Marriages were arranged. Pompey's union with Julia provided warmth and sincerity rare among Rome's calculated partnerships. Caesar, meanwhile, married Calpurnia, daughter of a powerful senator, further entwining his interests with the ruling class. Behind every public gesture was a private calculation. Even the spectacle of Bibulus, Caesar's co-consul, retreating from public life, leaving official documents to be dated in the consulship of Julius and Caesar, became a symbol of the new order, a joke repeated in the taverns and market squares. Yet even as Caesar reveled in his triumphs, he knew that the alliance was fragile. Crassus and Pompey eyed each other with growing suspicion, and the Senate watched with deepening alarm as traditional checks and balances were swept aside. Rome's oldest families muttered about tyranny and the death of the Republic, but the people cheered. Bread, land, and spectacle were powerful remedies for doubt. Caesar, at the center of it all, was careful to show both generosity and ruthlessness. He forgave some enemies, destroyed others, always maintaining the illusion that he served the people's will while he quietly amassed power. The final piece of Caesar's plan was the governorship of Gaula, vast, unruly region that promised both danger and reward. The Senate, hoping to remove him from Rome, granted him command of not just one province, but three: Cisalpine Gaul, Transalpine Gaul, and Illyricum. 4 legions would be at his disposal. To the elite, this seemed a clever way to sideline a dangerous rival, but Caesar saw the future more clearly than any of them. In Gaul, he would build an army loyal not to the Senate, but to himself. He would win new victories, earn untold riches, and acquire a base of power that no law or tradition could easily threaten. As he left Rome, the city crackled with anxiety. Friends celebrated, enemies plotted, and the Senate congratulated itself on a temporary solution. Few realized that in granting Caesar such authority, they had set in motion forces that would forever change Rome and the world beyond. The triumvirate, though destined to unravel, was for now the most formidable alliance Rome had ever seen. 3 men who, together, could shape destiny, yet whose ambitions would ultimately collide with cataclysmic results. With the Alps looming ahead and the future unfolding like a map yet to be drawn, Caesar rode out, leaving behind a Rome both hopeful and afraid, a city whose old order had been shattered by an alliance no one dared to challenge openly. The Republic had entered a new era, one in which ambition and alliance, not tradition, would decide the fate of all. Beyond the northern frontiers of Italy, where the Alps rise like a wall against the horizon and the air turns sharp and clear, lay a land that to most Romans was little more than a rumora wild and sprawling territory they called Gaul. For centuries, it had been the subject of dark tales and uneasy fascination. Travelers spoke of endless forests and deep, misty rivers, of fierce tribes who painted their bodies and worshipped mysterious gods in the groves, of chieftains whose pride equaled any Roman senator and whose feuds had spanned generations. But for all the distance and strangeness, Gaul was also tantalizingly close, its riches and dangers beckoning to any commander bold enough to try his luck. And now, at the edge of that ancient world, Caesar prepared to begin a campaign that would not only change his own fate, but redraw the map of Europe itself. The initial pretext was simpler migrating tribe, the Helvetii, numbering in the tens of thousands, sought to leave their mountain homeland and travel westward, passing through Roman provinces as they went. To the Senate, this was a minor problem, but to Caesar, it was opportunity disguised as crisis. With remarkable speed, he summoned his legions, built fortifications, and blocked the Helvetii's advance. In a series of rapid, hard-fought battles, he scattered their warriors, drove their families back into the hills, and sent news of his victory flashing back to Rome. But this was only the beginning. As word spread, other Gallic tribes began to see the Romans not just as distant overlords, but as immediate threats or possible allies, depending on circumstance and fear. In the spring that followed, another threat appeared, the Germanic warlord Ariovistus, who had crossed the Rhine with an army of towering warriors and sought to carve out a new kingdom in the heart of Gaul. The Gallic leaders, desperate to avoid annihilation, appealed to Caesar for help. Here, the Roman commander showed a genius for both war and diplomacy. He convened councils, listened to the grievances and boasts of tribal chiefs, and promised the security of Rome in return for loyalty. But when Ariovistus refused to back down, Caesar did not hesitate. He led his troops into the unknown, through dense forests and across rain-swollen rivers, and met the Germans on the open plain. The battle that followed was brutal and close, the outcome uncertain, until Caesar himself rode to the front, rallying his soldiers with calm authority. The Germanic line broke at last, and Ariovistus was driven back across the Rhine, the first but not the last to feel the iron of Roman resolve. Each victory brought new challenges, not less. Gaul was not a single nation, but a patchwork of tribes, each with its own traditions, ambitions, and ancient grudges. To conquer one was often to enrage another, and so Caesar found himself drawn ever deeper into the region's tangled politics. The Belgae of the north, alarmed by Rome's advance, gathered into a great confederation, threatening to overwhelm the invaders by sheer numbers. Yet Caesar, moving with the speed and adaptability that would become his trademark, struck before they were fully prepared, winning battles with a combination of audacity and ruthless pragmatism. He crossed rivers at night, built bridges in days where others would have taken weeks, and laid siege to strongholds whose defenders believed them unassailable. His army, growing hardened and loyal, came to believe that nothing was impossible under his command. But conquest was more than mere warfare. The winters in Gaul were long and harsh, with rain turning roads to rivers of mud and the legions often confined to their makeshift camps. It was during these cold months that Caesar's other talents emerged. He wrote rapacious commentaries on the Gallic war, describing his actions with clear, persuasive prose that made him a hero to the Roman people and a man of destiny in their eyes. He dispensed justice among the tribes, sometimes forgiving those who surrendered, sometimes exacting terrible retribution when rebellion flared. He knew when to threaten and when to promise, and he was quick to exploit divisions among his enemies, making some his clients and others his warnings to all. Each year brought fresh resistance, new revolts to suppress, and further frontiers to cross. The Veneti of the West, skilled seafarers who ruled the ocean in swift ships, challenged Rome's control of the coast. Caesar responded by having his engineers devise grappling hooks to seize their vessels, turning the unfamiliar waters into a stage for Roman ingenuity. When he found himself facing coalitions of tribes larger than any single legion could hope to defeat, he manipulated rivalries, bribed chieftains, and spread misinformation. ensuring that unity never lasted long among his foes. And as the campaign stretched on, Caesar's ambition began to match the scale of his victories. With Gaul largely subdued, he set his sights beyond the known world. Twice, he ordered his legions to construct massive bridges over the Rhine not to hold territory, but to show the Germanic tribes that nowhere was safe from Roman reach. Then, in a feat that dazzled the public imagination, he crossed the sea and invaded Britain itself, a place so remote that many Romans doubted it existed at all. The campaigns there were short and costly, and brought little in the way of new wealth, but they added to the aura of invincibility that now surrounded his name. Yet even as he triumphed, the cost of conquest was immense. The land was scarred by war. Cities burned, villages emptied, and the population suffered hardship and loss on a scale that would echo in memory for generations. Caesar's men, too, paid the price, enduring hunger, exhaustion, and constant peril. But these shared hardships bound them ever more closely to their general. For the first time, Rome possessed an army that owed its loyalty not to the Senate or the Republic, but to the man who led them through every trial and triumph. Caesar's men, they called themselves, proud of a bond forged in blood and victory. The greatest test came near the end of his years in Gaul. Vercingetorix, a brilliant young chieftain of the Arverni, united the Gallic tribes in a final, desperate uprising. The revolt swept across the country, catching the Romans off guard and threatening to undo all that Caesar had accomplished. Villages were burned to deny food to the invaders. Roman outposts were wiped out, and for a moment, it seemed the entire land might rise against the conqueror. Caesar, outnumbered and isolated, responded with characteristic boldness. At the hill fort of Alesia, he besieged Vercingetorix's forces, building not one but 2 walls sown, to keep the defenders in, another to keep rescuers out. Food ran low on both sides. The nights echoed with cries of desperation and the clash of weapons as relief armies threw themselves against the Roman lines. Yet when the last Gallic charge failed, Vercingetorix surrendered in person, laying down his arms at Caesar's feet, a moment that marked the end of free Gaul and the rise of Rome's new dominion. In less than a decade, Caesar had subdued a territory of staggering size, defeated countless foes, and amassed wealth that wiped away his debts and filled the coffers of Rome. But the consequences went beyond gold or glory. He returned to Italy with a hardened army and a reputation that rivaled or surpassed Pompey's at the height of his powers. In the process, he had changed both himself and the Republic. Rome, which had sent a desperate, indebted nobleman north, now faced the return of a man who commanded the loyalty of tens of thousands, who had become a legend in his own lifetime, and who would never again be content with anything less than the heights of power. The conquest of Gaul had not only changed a land and its people, it had set in motion events that would soon rock the very foundations of Rome. The air in Rome crackled with anxiety as the news from Gaul became legend, then warning. For years, the Senate had dismissed the idea that one man could truly threaten the Republic. Now, with Caesar victorious across the north and leading a battle-hardened army utterly devoted to him, the old men of the Senate found themselves looking nervously over their shoulders. Haunted by the memory of Marius and Sulla, those who had crossed boundaries Rome was built to protect. Yet the danger did not announce itself in open confrontation, but rather in a slow unraveling, as if the very fabric of the Republic were being picked apart, thread by thread. The triumvirate, that had once seemed unbreakable, began to falter under the weight of its own ambitions and tragedies. The alliance had always been an uneasy, 1-3 men, bound by mutual interest, not by trust or affection. Yet for a time, they had each needed the others, and Rome had bent to their will. Now, the first fracture appeared in the form of loss, not treachery. Julia, the beloved daughter of Caesar and the wife of Pompey, died in childbirth, her infant son perishing with her. The marriage had been the last, fragile thread binding the 2 most dangerous men in Rome, and with its sudden snapping, the city seemed to pause, breathless, sensing what might come next. The people mourned Julia with an outpouring of public grief, insisting she be buried with honors normally reserved for Rome's greatest statesmen. For Pompey, the loss was deeply personal. For Caesar, it was both sorrow and warning. Without that familial link, there was nothing left to hold Pompey back from rival ambitions. If Julia's death was a tragedy, what followed was a disaster. Crassus, never content to play the lesser role, sought his own measure of glory in the east, where Parthia, Rome's ancient foe, awaited. In a single campaign, years of calculation were undone. Crassus's legions were massacred, he himself killed, and legend says molten gold was poured down his throat in mockery of his greed. With his death, the triumvirate dissolved into open rivalry. Now there were only two powers in Rome, and the balance was broken. Pompey, left as the Senate's last champion, drifted ever closer to the old guard, finding in their traditions a new source of authority. He was made sole consul in an unprecedented emergency measure, a gesture meant to preserve order, but which only increased the sense of looming crisis. Meanwhile, Rome itself grew more chaotic, not less. Rival gangs stalked the streets, their leaders Clodius and Milo waging war for influence and vengeance, making a mockery of law and government. Fires, riots, assassinations, the city seemed to slide toward anarchy, and the old structures of power proved helpless to halt the tide. Elections were postponed, magistrates attacked, and the Senate's debates rang hollow in the ears of a populace grown weary of talk and hungry for action. As the situation worsened, the Senate looked to Pompey, granting him ever greater powers. The irony was bitter. The same body that had once feared Pompey as a would-be tyrant now embraced him as the Republic's savior, a bulwark against the even greater threat they saw in Caesar. Pompey accepted their trust, with all the public virtue expected of Rome's champion, but privately, he made preparations for the struggle he knew was coming. He solidified his hold on the city, ensured the loyalty of key senators, and positioned his legions in strategic outposts across the east and Italy. Across the Alps, Caesar watched, his own position increasingly precarious. The Senate's patience was running out, and the political knives were being sharpened. Caesar's term as governor in Gaul would soon expire, and with it, the immunity that shielded him from prosecution for the bold, often illegal maneuvers he had used to win and keep power. His enemies in Rome, led by Cato and the conservative faction, made it clear that the moment he set foot in Italy as a private citizen, he would be put on trial, his career, his life, his family's fortunes all hanging in the balance. Caesar was too shrewd to walk blindly into such a trap. He needed to return to Rome, but on his own terms, with the dignity and security that came from holding office. He proposed, again and again, that he be allowed to stand for consul in absentia, as Pompey himself had once done, but each request was denied. The Senate, emboldened by Pompey's support, made plans to replace him in Gaul before his command ended, a direct challenge and a signal that the time for compromise was ending. Behind the scenes, emissaries shuttled between the camps, searching for some last-minute settlement. Caesar offered to disarm if Pompey would do the same, knowing full well that Pompey, entrenched in Italy, could always raise new legions, while Caesar, separated from his veterans, would be left defenseless. No agreement was possible. Tension built with each passing week, until Rome itself seemed to hold its breath. The final pretext for conflict came when Mark Antony, fiercely loyal to Caesar and now tribune of the plebs, attempted to veto the Senate's actions. When Pompey's supporters turned to violence threatening Antony, forcing him and fellow tribunes to flee the city disguised as slaves, Caesar was presented with the legal cover he needed. The rights of the tribunes were sacrosanct, protected by centuries of tradition. By attacking them, the Senate and Pompey gave Caesar the excuse to portray his own actions, not as personal ambition, but as a defense of the Republic's very foundations. On a cold winter night, at the banks of the Rubicona, modest stream marking the edge of his province, Caesar paused, reflecting on the enormity of what he was about to do. To cross the river with his army would be to declare war on Rome itself. Ancient stories tell of his hesitation, The moment he is said to have uttered the fateful words, the die is cast. In that instant, a point of no return was crossed, and the fate of the Republic hung by a thread. News of his advance spread through Italy like wildfire. Panic seized Rome as it became clear that Pompey and the Senate had made inadequate preparations, their faith in swift victory dashed by the speed and confidence of Caesar's movements. In a decision that shocked even his allies, Pompey chose not to defend the city, instead ordering the Senate and much of the government to withdraw south to Brundisium, hoping to regroup in Greece, where his eastern resources and allies could be mustered for war. The impact was immediate and profound. For centuries, the Romans had believed that their city, eternal and sacred, was inviolable. Now, they watched as its rulers abandoned it without a fight, leaving the people to face the conqueror alone. Towns and provinces along Caesar's path opened their gates, some from fear, others from hope that he might bring an end to years of chaos. Old rivals sent envoys offering support. Even soldiers in Pompey's armies hesitated, remembering the general who had led them to glory in Gaul. The man who had been dismissed as a reckless gambler, an indebted aristocrat, now marched through Italy virtually unopposed, achieving in weeks what others had struggled for in lifetimes. Yet Caesar moved with care. He forbade looting, ordered discipline, and presented himself not as a conqueror, but as a restorer of order, promising clemency to all who laid down their arms. When he entered Rome, the city was silent, its temples and homes untouched, its citizens uncertain, but unharmed. In the emptied Senate house, with only a handful of senators remaining, Caesar could reflect on the extraordinary path that had brought him from the crowded streets of the Subura to the very center of Roman power. But his work was far from done. Across the sea, Pompey was gathering his forces, and the real battle for Rome's soul was only beginning. The civil war, whose shadows had darkened the city for years, was now upon them in full, and no one, not Caesar, not Pompey, not the trembling senators in their villas could say what would remain standing when it was over. Caesar stood at the gates of Rome not as a liberator, nor as a conqueror, but as an enigma man who had seized the city without bloodshed, whose enemies had fled before him, leaving behind only silence and anxiety. Yet, beneath this outward calm, the foundations of the Republic trembled, and every citizen knew that the peace could not last. For the first time in centuries, Rome's ancient streets echoed with uncertainty about the very future of the state. As the people awaited what would come next, Caesar moved with a mix of caution and confidence, aware that his position, though powerful, was far from secure. He had captured the heart of the Republic, but the true seat of legitimacy had slipped across the sea, following Pompey and the Senate into exile. It was a strange, almost surreal period. Caesar moved quickly to reassure the city, opening the state granaries, releasing grain hoarded by Pompey's men, and promising clemency for all who submitted. Rome's people, long exhausted by violence and scarcity, responded with relief, but the Senate's absence left a void in authority. Some muttered that this was the act of a tyrant, others whispered that perhaps, finally, someone would restore order, but Caesar did not linger in indecision. He needed more than the goodwill of the Macesh, needed legal and military dominance. The city's future would be decided on distant battlefields, not in the Senate house or the bustling markets. Beyond Rome, the world was gathering against him. Pompey had not fled out of fear, but out of calculation. With command of the seas and the allegiance of the eastern provinces wealthy, populous, and filled with experienced legions, she had every reason to believe that, in time, he could marshal a force to crush Caesar and restore the old order. His prestige was immense, his name carried weight in the East, and the Senate, too, believed that victory was only a matter of time. In Spain, veteran armies loyal to Pompey's lieutenants stood ready to move. In Africa, powerful governors waited to see which way the winds would blow before committing their forces. Faced with these realities, Caesar made a bold decision that stunned his enemies and cemented his legend as a master of rapid, unexpected action. Rather than waiting for Pompey to invade Italy from Greece or allow his enemies in Spain to unite with those across the Adriatic, he divided his forces. Leaving Mark Antony to hold Rome and Italy, Caesar himself marched west, crossing the mountains into Spain, before Pompey's generals could fully coordinate their defense. The campaign that followed was a masterpiece of maneuver warfare, with Caesar using speed, deception, and relentless pressure to cut off the Pompeian armies from supplies and water, forcing surrender after surrender without risking a major pitched battle. The Spanish legions, defeated but treated with uncharacteristic clemency, would become a crucial source of strength for Caesar in the battles to come. While Caesar was away, his supporters in Rome named him Dictatoran, emergency post, of extraordinary powers but limited duration. True to form, Caesar held the office only long enough to secure the political arrangements he required, stepping down after just 11 days, and then securing his election as consul for the following year. In this way, he cloaked his authority in the forms of the Republic, even as he bent its traditions to his will. With Spain pacified and Italy secured, Caesar turned his eyes to the east, where Pompey, now joined by a formidable coalition of Roman senators and foreign allies, awaited him in Greece. The challenge was immense. Pompey's command of the seas made it nearly impossible to transport an army in safety, and his forces were numerous, well-equipped, and ably led. Caesar gathered what ships he could, but the task was daunting. His army would have to cross the Adriatic piecemeal, in winter, facing the constant threat of interception by Pompey's fleets. It was the sort of risk only a gambler, a genius, would take. Against all odds, Caesar personally led the first contingent across the stormy sea, landing in Epirus and establishing a precarious beachhead. For weeks, he was cut off from the rest of his army, supplies dwindling, while Mark Antony and the remaining legions waited for a chance to follow. Pompey moved swiftly to contain the threat, seeking to starve Caesar's forces into surrender. Skirmishes and engineering contests ensued, with both armies building massive fortifications and launching raids under the cover of darkness. At Dyrrhachium, Caesar came closer to defeat than at any other time in his career, as a sudden breach in his lines allowed Pompey's forces to inflict serious losses and nearly break the siege. Only the discipline and loyalty of his veterans, and Caesar's own refusal to panic, saved the day. Even in defeat, he managed to withdraw his battered forces and regroup. Pompey's caution proved to be his undoing. Though his officers urged a decisive pursuit, he hesitated, confident that time was on his side. Yet, as the weeks dragged on, the political pressures of common ambitious senators, restless allies, forced his hand. Finally, at Pharsalus, on a plain in central Greece, the two greatest armies of the age met for the battle that would decide Rome's destiny. Pompey had every advantage in numbers, especially in cavalry, and he planned to use this strength to encircle and crush Caesar's smaller, more experienced force. But Caesar, ever the innovator, prepared for this very move. At the critical moment, when Pompey's horsemen drove back Caesar's flank, a hidden reserve of infantry emerged, wielding their pila not as javelins, but as thrusting spears, driving directly into the faces of the cavalry. The tactic was so unexpected that Pompey's cavalry broke in confusion, exposing the flank and allowing Caesar's legions to roll up the line. As the rout began, Pompey's invincible general collapsed into indecision, leaving his men to fend for themselves while he fled the battlefield in disguise. The aftermath was remarkable not only for the scale of the victory, but for Caesar's policy of clemency. Where Sulla had killed by the thousands and Pompey's own men had slaughtered prisoners, Caesar pardoned his enemies' famous men like Brutus, Cassius, and Cicero, believing that reconciliation, not terror, would secure his future. He allowed senators to return to Rome and restored their property, turning former foes into grateful, if wary, supporters. His enemies accused him of hypocrisy, but the ordinary Romans saw only mercy and strength combined. Pompey himself fled east, seeking refuge in Egypt, where he believed old debts would be repaid with sanctuary. But the world had shifted. Pharaoh's ministers, seeking to curry favor with the likely victor, murdered Pompey on the shore and presented his severed head to Caesar. The gesture was intended to ingratiate, but it filled Caesar with sorrow and disgust. He ordered Pompey's remains buried with honor and punished those responsible, marking a new chapter in the story of Romea, chapter in which the rules were being rewritten by the victors, day by day. With the civil war's central conflict resolved, Caesar faced new and unexpected challenges in the east, as Egypt's own royal family became entangled with the ambitions of Rome's new master. Yet even as he settled disputes and pursued new intrigues, the memory of Pharsalus lingered. The Republic, as it had existed for centuries, was gone in all but name, its future to be decided by the will of a single man. The armies of the world had clashed, and Rome's fate had been decided not in the Senate, nor the Forum, but in blood and dust, under a foreign sun. And so, with the echoes of battle still ringing in his ears, Caesar stepped from the chaos of war into a new and uncertain world, one in which he, for a time, would hold all the power and all the peril of Rome in his hands. Alexandria shimmered in the Mediterranean sun, a city unlike any Caesar had ever known. Marble palaces lined its harbors, statues of forgotten gods gazed down from grand columns, and the world's greatest library whispered with the knowledge of centuries. Here, in the crossroads of East and West, cultures mingled and power was measured in subtlety as much as strength. Yet beneath its veneer of beauty and intellect, Alexandria was a city in turmoil. Caesar, arriving in pursuit of Pompey, stepped into a palace racked by civil war and intrigue, drawn into a world of ambition as dangerous as any battlefield. When Caesar's ship docked, he did not find his rival alive, but was instead greeted with the grisly trophy of Pompey's severed head, presented by Ptolemy XIII's ministers as an offering to the new master of Rome. Caesar recoiled at the sight. In that moment, all the years of rivalry, of struggle and war, ended not in triumph but in sorrow. Pompey, once the greatest man in Rome, was reduced to a token in another's game. Caesar, ever the showman, ordered a funeral with full honors and mourned the loss as much for the sake of his own legend as for the man himself. His enemies accused him of hypocrisy, but for Caesar, mercy and grandeur always walked hand in hand. The Egyptian court, meanwhile, was split by a bitter struggle for the throne. The young king Ptolemy XIII, barely a teenager, held the city, but his older sister, Cleopatra, brilliant and charismatic, had been forced into exile and plotted her return. The palace buzzed with conspiracies and double crosses, and Caesar, arriving with only a handful of troops, became the prize both factions sought to win. He declared himself arbiter of the dispute, invoking Rome's role as Egypt's protector, but in truth, he saw in Cleopatra a partner who might help secure his position, both in Alexandria and beyond. Cleopatra, banished from her home and forbidden entry to the palace, orchestrated her famous arrival with a sense of drama that matched Caesar's own. Smuggled through enemy lines, concealed in a rolled-up carpet, she emerged before Caesar in the dead of night, a gesture as symbolic as it was audacious. She was 21, fluent in a dozen languages, skilled in mathematics, politics, and seduction. Their alliance, born of necessity, swiftly deepened into fascination. Cleopatra's wit and confidence intrigued Caesar, who saw in her the spirit of the East, untamed, subtle, and formidable. But neither the palace nor the city would surrender quietly. Ptolemy's advisors, sensing the threat, roused the Alexandrian mob against Caesar. The Roman found himself besieged in the royal quarter, surrounded by thousands of soldiers and an angry populace. Days and nights blurred into one another as Caesar's outnumbered legionaries defended their barricades, fending off attacks from land and sea. Supplies ran low, and the defenders dug wells in desperation when the enemy cut off the city's aqueducts. The siege turned brutal, and unpredictable fires broke out in the docks, spreading to the library itself. Scrolls, containing the wisdom of ages, vanished in smoke and flame, an accidental tragedy for which Caesar would forever be blamed, rightly or wrongly. Cleopatra never left his side, sharing both the danger and the hope that together they could outlast their foes. She moved through the chaos with a confidence that made her a rallying point for those who still believed the future might belong to them. Outside, the city's factions jostled for advantage, with Ptolemy's generals plotting to lure Caesar into an ambush. He responded with a mixture of cunning and daring, sending secret messages, orchestrating feints, and even, according to legend, leaping into the harbor and swimming to safety through a hail of missiles, all the while holding his precious papers above the water to keep them dry. After months of siege, fortune turned. Reinforcements arrived by sea auxiliaries from Asia Minor, summoned by Caesar's allies. In a final, desperate engagement, Caesar's troops broke the enemy lines at the Battle of the Nile. Ptolemy himself drowned trying to flee, his golden armor dragging him down into the muddy water. The civil war was over. Cleopatra, restored to the throne, ruled as queen beside her younger brother, a nominal co-ruler who would never threaten her authority again. The aftermath was a time of indulgence and intrigue. With Egypt pacified, Caesar allowed himself the rarest of luxuries: rest. For months, he lingered in Alexandria, basking in the city's pleasures and Cleopatra's company. They sailed up the Nile together on a barge fit for a god and goddess, surrounded by music, feasting, and the scent of lotus. In these languid weeks, Caesar found more than distraction. He was enchanted by the vision of monarchy, of rule by divine right, untroubled by senatorial debate and the petty squabbles of the Roman aristocracy. Cleopatra's court seemed a glimpse of what power could be: unified, beautiful, absolute. Their bond soon produced a son, Ptolemy Caesar, nicknamed Caesarion, whom Cleopatra presented as the true heir of both Rome and Egypt. Gossip and scandal spread back to Rome, where rumors swirled about the aging conqueror bewitched by an Eastern queen, abandoning republican virtue for foreign luxury. Caesar, ever pragmatic, left a Roman garrison in Alexandria to secure Cleopatra's throne, ensuring that Egypt would be Rome's in all but name. He sailed away at last, summoned by the news of revolt and unrest elsewhere in his dominions. His time in Egypt left indelible marks. He had lost an old enemy and gained a new partner. He had witnessed both the glories and perils of absolute power. As he departed Alexandria, Caesar carried with him the lessons of the East, the knowledge that order could be imposed by the will of one, that beauty and authority could be merged, and that, for those bold enough, the world could be remade by dream and ambition alike. Beyond the city, storms gathered. The civil war was not over. Africa and Spain still harbored enemies, and Rome itself simmered with the unresolved tensions of revolution. Yet for a moment, as the Mediterranean wind filled his sails and the lights of Alexandria faded behind him, Caesar stood between two worlds: Roman by birth, but changed forever by the intoxicating promise of the Nile and the queen who ruled it. The future would call him back to war and to Rome, but in the shimmering wake of that Egyptian interlude, nothing in Caesar's life would ever be quite the same. When Caesar returned from Egypt to the city of Rome, he found a world transformed by war, yet desperately in need of the order he alone could impose. The Republic's old rhythms had broken. The city was bloated with refugees and veterans, its treasury strained to the breaking point, the people hungry not just for bread, but for stability, after years of violence and political chaos. In his absence, the Republic's machinery had all but ceased. Mark Antony's rule as his representative had left the capital divided and fractious. Mutinies smoldered among the legions, whose patience for promises was running thin. Creditors, emboldened by rumor and desperate by hardship, clashed with debtors in the streets. The social fabric, torn by civil war, needed urgent repair. Caesar's return was sudden, almost theatrical. Mutinous legions in Campania, restless after years of fighting, fell silent as he appeared in their midst, not in armor, but in a simple toga, addressing them not as soldiers, but as citizens, a deliberate and stinging reminder of what they would become if they turned against him. The gesture worked. Shame and loyalty conquered mutiny, and the legions begged to serve again under his command. Caesar had learned from the mistakes of Sulla and Marius. Mercy could secure what terror could not. At the same time, he understood that some concessions were necessary. He offered debt relief, cancelling accumulated interest, permitting property to be valued at pre-war levels for settlement, thereby satisfying neither radicals nor hardliners, but diffusing the immediate crisis and maintaining the delicate balance that would hold Rome together, at least for now. But the horizon still glimmered with war. In Africa, the remnants of the Pompeian cause Cato, Scipio, and King Juba of Numidia gathered one last great army, determined to avenge their defeats. 14 legions stood ready against Caesar, bolstered by Numidian cavalry, their banners a final challenge to the man they called usurper. Caesar moved quickly, assembling his own force, sailing south in the winter of 46 BC, and landing in Africa with a mixture of veterans and fresh recruits, many of whom struggled with the unfamiliar terrain and tactics of their Numidian foes. It was a campaign of maneuver, hardship, and frustration, with supply shortages and ambushes dragging the war out for months. At Thapsus, the issue was finally decided. Unlike his careful control at earlier battles, Caesar's troops, frustrated and eager for revenge, broke ranks and unleashed a slaughter that cost nearly 50,000 lives. The violence shocked even Caesar, whose policy of clemency faltered in the face of such carnage. Most tellingly, Cato, Rome's last uncompromising republican, chose suicide in Utica rather than live in a world ruled by Caesar, his death a silent protest and a symbol of the end of an era. Rome erupted in celebration at the news. When Caesar returned in triumph, he did so not for a single victory, but for 4: Gaul, Egypt, Pontus, and Africa. 4 great processions moved through the city in as many days, the streets crowded with spoils, captives, animals, and wonders from across the known world. Soldiers followed his chariot, singing crude verses at their general's expense, a ritual meant to avert divine envy, but also a reminder that, in Rome, no man, no matter how powerful, stood wholly above the people's judgment. Yet, the sheer scale of the spectacle was unmistakable. Caesar's image was everywhere, on coins, in statuary, at the head of vast crowds. A golden throne awaited him in the Senate. His name and face were immortalized, as never before honors once reserved for kings and gods. For many Romans, it was a moment of awe. For others, it was a signal that the line between republic and monarchy had blurred beyond recognition. With military opposition crushed, Caesar turned his full attention to rebuilding Rome and reshaping its future. The republic he found was not the one he had left. The Senate was hollowed out, many of its members dead, exiled, or discredited. To fill its empty benches, Caesar expanded the body to 900 members, admitting new men from Italy, Gaul, Spain, and the provinces. Old families looked on in horror as barbarians in togas entered the chamber, their accents and customs the subject of endless gossip and satire. But for Caesar, the reform was practical. It broadened the base of support for his regime and wove the growing empire into a single political fabric, however thin that fabric might stretch. Other reforms followed in rapid succession. To ease urban unemployment, Caesar established overseas colonies settling tens of thousands of veterans and poor citizens in lands as far away as Carthage and Corinth. In doing so, he not only rewarded loyal soldiers, but spread Roman customs, law, and identity to every corner of the Mediterranean. To restore order to the chaotic Roman calendar, he summoned the best astronomers of Alexandria and instituted the Julian calendar, aligning months with the sun rather than the moon. It was a practical, enduring achievement, so effective that its influence would persist for more than 15 centuries. Roads were repaired and extended, new temples and public buildings rose, and the city's infrastructure, neglected through years of conflict, was gradually restored. Caesar's vision for Rome was both grand and deeply personal. He believed in a Mediterranean world united by Roman administration and law, its prosperity secured not by endless war, but by efficient government, trade, and the extension of citizenship. He welcomed teachers, doctors, and artists from across the provinces, granting them citizenship and encouraging the flow of talent and innovation into the city. New regulations on the grain dole curtailed abuses, but ensured that the poor did not go hungry. Tax collection in the provinces was reformed to protect against corruption, and the courts were reorganized to ensure justice, at least as much justice as could exist in a world where Caesar's word was now law. But power had its dangers. The very reforms that made Caesar popular with the masses and the provinces unsettled Rome's old elite. His refusal to stand as first among equals, his willingness to accept honors that bordered on monarchy statues among the kings, a month renamed July in his honor, the title dictator for life, were signs that the old compact between patrician and plebeian, senator and tribune, had been irreparably altered. The Senate still met, but its authority was shadowed by Caesar's presence. Elections continued, but his recommendations carried the force of command. For every supporter, there was a silent enemy, nursing wounded pride and watching for a moment of weakness. Even in victory, Caesar's policy of clemency remained a double-edged sword. Most former enemies were pardoned and restored to public life, though never to their old influence. The city hummed with rumors and suspicions. The triumphal celebrations, once symbols of Rome's greatness, now seemed to some like monuments to civil strife celebration, for the first time, of victories over fellow Romans rather than foreign foes. The Senate, eager to appease the new master, heaped unprecedented honors upon him. Yet many of those who cheered him in public whispered in private about the dangers of one-man rule. As the year wore on, word came from Spain that the last Pompeian resistance was gathering under Pompey's sons, Gnaeus and Sextus. Refusing to leave unfinished work, Caesar entrusted Rome to his lieutenants and sailed for Iberia, leading his veterans into one final, desperate campaign. At Munda, the fighting was so fierce that Caesar himself seized a shield and joined the front lines, shaming his men by example. 30,000 Pompeians fell in the struggle, the remnants of civil war snuffed out at last. News of victory brought yet another triumphant final, uneasy celebration in which the boundaries between honor, ambition, and the specter of monarchy seemed to dissolve. At the pinnacle of power, Caesar now stood alone, his authority unchecked, his vision for Rome half completed and wholly personal. The Republic still lived, but only in name. The institutions of law and debate now danced to the tune of a single man's will. Even the very calendar was his. And yet, as the dust settled and a restless peace settled over Rome, a fundamental question remained unresolved. Could one man, no matter how brilliant or well-intentioned, reshape the world by force of personality alone, or would the ghosts of the Republic, the pride and envy of Rome's ancient families, yet find a way to reclaim the city that had once belonged to them all? For now, the answer hung in the air, as Caesar, undefeated but ever watchful, prepared for the next challenge and ever imagining how soon his triumph would become tragedy.